All right, Danielle, over to you.
All right, great. Thank you, Nina. Okay, so welcome to today's training session. This is the highlights of the Licensed Professionals Guide. So as the title suggests, this session is primarily geared toward licensed professionals who verify applications for Energy Star certification for commercial buildings. However, if you're not a licensed professional, this session may still be useful for you if you work with them or if you have an active role in certifying commercial buildings. So note that this presentation will cover the regular rules for site visits and application submission. However, it's important to note up front that there will be some additional flexibility built into the regular rules for property types that have been affected by the score review period and the associated certification suspension. Those property types will still be able to apply for both 2018 and 2019 certification with these relaxed rules, and we'll go over those rules a little bit at the end of the webinar today. All right, so a brief agenda for today's session. We'll cover eligibility requirements for LPs, followed by the highlights of the LP responsibilities during the application verification process, including conducting the site visit, reviewing energy consumption, and completing the application process by signing and stamping the application. We'll also briefly cover what happens when an application is selected for an audit, as well as the LP's role in the audit process. So before we dive in, it's also worth noting that this training session is not a substitute for a thorough review of the LP guide itself. Any licensed professional who verifies Energy Star applications should read that document and be familiar with the policies and the procedures that it outlines. This presentation gives an overview of what to expect in that document and can also serve as a refresher for anyone who has read the document and just wants some high-level reminders of its content. So right up front here, we have a link to that LP guide. It's very easy, energystar.gov/LP guide. So if you haven't read that document yet, I encourage you to do so. All right, so first up, who can act as a licensed professional on an Energy Star application? So first, an LP must be a professional engineer or a registered architect in either the US or Canada and in good standing. Secondly, they need to possess a working knowledge of building HVAC and lighting systems, as well as the latest versions of ASHRAE Standards 55 and 62 and the IASNA Lighting Handbook. And finally, they need to understand all the applicable state and territorial licensure laws, professional ethics requirements, and other applicable regulations. Note that the LP does not need to be licensed in the same state or territory as the building whose application they're verifying. But if they're not, they should make sure they're familiar with any state or local laws related to the building's location. EPA relies on these two specific license types, PEs and RAs, because of the high professional standards associated with these types of licenses, as well as the accountability provided by having a license issued by a government body. One of the most important responsibilities for the LP is to conduct or at least to oversee the site visit to the property. Application details may be verified remotely in some cases, but a site visit is still required for every single application. So it's recommended that details be verified as much as possible during that site visit. It's recommended that the LP perform the site visit, but it's also permissible for them to deputize someone else to perform the visit under their supervision and their instruction. The LP still takes ultimate responsibility for the information reported on the application, so they should be sure to give whoever they deputize clear instructions in this case. So the site visit may take place anytime within the 12-month application period or within the 120-day period following the application's period ending date. So for example, if I'm submitting an application and the application's year ending date is December 31st, 2018, then my site visit can occur anytime during calendar year 2018 or during the first 120 days of 2019. So up until late April 2019, right about now actually. So generally the best time to perform the site visit is during the 12-month application period or else very early in that 120-day period following the year ending date. You want to perform the site visit at a time that will allow you to most accurately assess the conditions of the building during the 12-month application period. So for example, for a K-12 school, you want to make sure to conduct the site visit while school is in session, not during a vacation or a break. If a building is undergoing a major renovation in the final month of their application period, you want to make sure you conduct the site visit before that renovation occurs, so you can get a sense of the building conditions during the majority of the application period, since 11 of the 12 months in that case would be pre-renovation. An important consequence of the site visit date rules is that a single site visit may be valid for 2 consecutive applications, as long as the rules are met for both years. So for example, if we go back to that example application from before, a 2018 application with a year ending date of December 31st, 2018, let's say you performed that site visit on December 15th, 2018, just before the end of the 12-month application period. Obviously, that's within the allowed date range for that 2018 application. Now for 2019, let's say you got 11 new months of data and you use November 30th, 2019 as your year ending date. This would mean that your 2019 application is for the 12-month period from December 1st, 2018 through November 30th, 2019. So the previous site visit date of December 15th, 2018, it still falls within that range, and thus it can be used as a valid site visit date for your 2019 application as well. This is also true if your site visit had occurred during the first 120 days of calendar year 2019. In that case, that would have fallen during the 120-day eligibility window after the year ending date for your 2018 application, and within the first 4 to 5 months of your 2019 application's 12-month period. So if you do this, you'll still want to check in with the building owners and managers to make sure the conditions in the building haven't changed. But as long as there's no reason to believe there have been major changes and you're still able to get a look at the energy data to verify that all the information on the application is accurate, then you can reuse site visit dates like this. All right, so during your site visit, and if necessary via communication with the building owners or managers before or after the site visit, the LP is responsible for verifying all the information on the application. So we'll start with the basic property information, starting with what you see on the first page of an application. So first, make sure that all the basic information on the first page is accurate, including the name the owners want displayed on the registry. So this is the name that on the registry of Energy Star certified buildings online that will be displayed. The property type, gross floor area, year it was built, and the application year ending date. Make sure all of that information is accurate, and then of course the location and contact information. So you'll go on to manually confirm that this information in the basic property information section of the application is accurate, in addition to average occupancy and the number of buildings. So this is the first section in the application with a notes section. LPs are encouraged to use the notes field in the application as often as needed to explain anything unique or irregular about the building. So for example, there are some rare cases where a portion of the building may be excluded if it meets certain very specific criteria. These criteria can be found online in our Portfolio Manager FAQs if you're interested. And in that case, the LP might check no in response to the whole property verification in question 7. If they do that, they would need to use the notes field to provide an explanation for why they check no and what is being excluded from the property. So be sure to use that notes field liberally. When verifying the property type, be sure to familiarize yourself with the specific eligibility requirements for the property type in question. There are some general eligibility requirements that all buildings have to meet, including those listed here. Hold on, sorry, I lost my place. But there are also very specific eligibility requirements for specific property types. Since the Energy Star score compares your building to its peer group of buildings in the national population, it's important that these definitions are applied consistently and that a building is not being misclassified. So for example, a K-12 school needs to fit a very specific definition in order to be eligible for certification. It must primarily serve students in grades K-12. We've received applications in the past for preschools, adult education facilities, or part-time learning programs. None of these meet the K-12 school definition because they were not included in the reference data set used to generate the K-12 school score model. So those applications needed to be denied. So even if you think it may be obvious, please be sure to familiarize yourself with the eligibility requirements and definitions for any property types that you deal with. Another piece of basic information you'll need to verify is the gross floor area, which is the total floor area measured between the outside surface of the exterior walls of the building. This should include all leasable areas, common areas, as well as support, mechanical, and electrical areas. Note that the gross floor area is not the same thing as leasable or rentable space. Leasable or rentable space is a subset of the gross floor area, So please make sure this is being accurately measured per EPA definition. And always make sure the gross floor area reported on the application accounts for the whole property. Certification is awarded on a whole property basis, so make sure the application is not just accounting for a single floor or suite within an office building, for example. Moving on to number of buildings. Most property types are certified on a single building basis. This includes office buildings, which are the most common certified property type, accounting for roughly half of the applications we receive each year. The only property types eligible to apply as a campus of buildings are hotels, K-12 schools, hospitals, senior care communities, and multifamily housing. So in fact, for these property types, if they consist of multiple buildings, then they must apply as a multi-building campus. They cannot cherry pick which buildings to include on the application and which to exclude. So for example, if a multifamily housing complex consists of 2 residential towers, a leasing office building, and a community center, all 4 of those buildings would need to be included in the application. They could not submit an application for just a single tower or just the leasing office. Campuses are a huge topic that could have an hour-long webinar devoted just to that topic alone, so we won't get into too much detail here. But if you work with any of these 5 property types, or with multi-building properties, be sure to carefully review the campus guidelines available in the FAQs and on the Energy Star website. All right, let's quickly review a few examples of single versus multiple structures. A building with 2 towers that share 4 stories of common space, including an atrium and a cafeteria, and that have a seamless connection between the 2 towers, that would be considered a single structure. Side-by-side buildings that only share a common wall, however, as you might see in a downtown urban environment, would still be considered separate buildings if they're functionally and structurally distinct. 2 office towers built on top of an underground parking garage could be considered a single structure if the garage is included in the property. However, if the parking is excluded, which is EPA's preference, then the 2 towers could also be considered separate structures. However, you would definitely need to 2 office buildings whose only connection is an outdoor covered walkway, those would definitely need to be considered separate structures, and they would need to benchmark and certify separately. Stacked configurations, such as a high-rise with offices on floors 1 through 8 and condos on floors 9 through 14, that would be considered a single structure. Even if they have separate entrances and separate ownership, these share a footprint and are structurally the same building, and thus would need to benchmark and certify as a single structure. On the flip side, even if 2 office towers are owned and operated by the same entity, and even if they share a central plant and energy meters, if they don't share any physical structural connection, they would need to be benchmarked and certified separately. This may require the installation of submeters to accurately record each building's energy use if they share meters or a central plant. For more information on what constitutes a single structure and what constitutes multiple structures, be sure to visit our FAQ on the subject, which is linked here. The images here illustrate some of the scenarios we just talked about. The first shows 4 buildings on a city block. Even though they're physically connected via their shared walls, they're functionally and structurally separate and would therefore be considered 4 separate structures. The second image shows a skywalk between 2 towers. This does not constitute a seamless, substantial connection, so the 2 buildings that are connected by this walkway should be benchmarked separately. And the final image shows 2 taller towers and 1 smaller building, all built on top of a ground-level mall. This could be benchmarked either way. Either the mall could be considered a seamless connection between the towers, and thus the entire complex could be benchmarked as a single structure, or the towers could be benchmarked separately, and you could consider the connection between the mall and the office towers a distinct dividing line. If you're ever in doubt about a property's configuration and whether it should be benchmarked as a single structure or separated into multiple properties, you can always submit a support ticket at energystar.gov/buildingshelp. Okay, moving on to the assessment of indoor environmental quality. While some basic information and use details may be verified through phone calls or other contact with building staff, the indoor environmental quality really does need to be evaluated via an on-site assessment, since quantitative measurements need to be taken at the building during business hours to verify that the indoor environmental quality has not been compromised in pursuit of energy conservation. So to verify these standards, the LP should have a working knowledge of building HVAC and lighting systems, as well as ASHRAE standards 55 and 62, and the IESNA lighting handbook. Note that the LP guide includes an appendix called the Measurement Form for Indoor Environmental Quality. This form is intended to help LPs take the measurements required and record them in an easy-to-document format. This form is also required if the application is selected for an audit, which we'll get to later, so it's highly, highly recommended that this form be filled out for each site visit. We'll be looking at screenshots from the measurement form in just a minute. All right, this is what the Indoor Environmental Quality Assessment looks like on the application. As you can see, LPs are asked to verify adequate outdoor air ventilation, thermal environmental conditions, and illumination. So this is what every application requires. This is not the measurement form that's required for audits. For outdoor air ventilation, the building must meet ASHRAE Standard 62.1, Ventilation for Acceptable Indoor Air Quality. There are a few different ways that this standard can be verified, including direct airflow measurements, CO2 concentration measurements, or detailed calculations derived from the as-built equipment specifications and physical inspection of system operation and control. There are some property types, such as data centers, where this standard does not necessarily apply. So in that case, the LP should use their professional judgment to make a determination about whether this standard has been sacrificed for the sake of energy conservation, and should document their assessment in the notes field of the application. The Indoor Environmental Quality Measurement Form has further instructions for how to ensure this standard is met, so we'll get to that in a few minutes. All right, so this is what the outdoor air ventilation section looks like on the Indoor Environmental Quality Measurement Form. Again, this form can be found as an appendix to the LP guide and is required documentation if your application is selected for an audit. So as you can see, this section of the form prompts you to select the method you used to verify minimum outdoor ventilation rates. There are also checkboxes that you should check if the property falls into one of several special categories, such as naturally ventilated buildings, multifamily, hospitals, senior care, and other property types not explicitly covered in ASHRAE Standard 62. Finally, regardless of the method used, additional notes should be provided giving further description of the evaluation, as well as any notes or observations or any judgments made by the LP during the site visit. For thermal environmental conditions, LPs should document temperature and humidity at a minimum in a representative sample of spaces within the building to ensure compliance with ASHRAE Standard 55, thermal environmental conditions for human occupancy. They should also make note during their site visit of any indications of thermal discomfort for occupants, including the presence of fans, space heaters, or specific clothing. This is what the thermal environmental conditions section looks like on the measurement form. This screenshot shows space for 3 different locations, but the full form has space for 5, and larger buildings may need to sample even more locations. So the number of sampled spaces required for an accurate assessment of the property is left up to the discretion of the LP. For each sampled space, you should enter what the space is used for, along with the date and time it was sampled, followed by the required quantitative temperature and humidity measurements, with airspeed as an optional measurement. Any notes or observations should also be included, such as whether you noticed any personal fans or space heaters, clothing indicating thermal discomfort, whether too hot or too cold, or any indications that the required thermal comfort standards are not being met. Finally, illumination. ENERGY STAR certification requires that the building meet the illumination requirements outlined in the latest version of the IESNA Lighting Handbook. And again, if the specific illumination requirements from the handbook do not apply to the property type in question, the LP should use their professional judgment to determine if adequate lighting conditions exist in the building and should document that assessment in the application. Here's the lighting section of the measurement form. Just like with thermal conditions, you should record basic information about each space in which illumination was sampled. Either horizontal or vertical illumination measurements are acceptable, so while columns for both are provided, only one of them needs to be filled in. All right, next we'll talk about verifying property use details. This is a sample page from an office application. Each of the items you see listed here, including weekly operating hours, number of workers on the main shift, and number of computers, are known as property use details. Each of these details are factored into the ENERGY STAR score, so it's important that they're accurate. First, the LP should assess whether the property use type and use details have been correctly characterized and entered. This goes back to the property type definition issue that we discussed earlier. It's possible to have multiple property uses within a building, so if, for example, an office building has a separate retail store use broken out, It's the LP's job to make sure that the retail store use is correctly classified. Retail store, for purposes of Energy Star benchmarking and certification, has a very specific definition, and it should only be used for single stores that are greater than 5,000 square feet. They need to have an exterior public entrance, and they need to be used primarily for the retail sale of non-food consumer goods. So if you had a collection of, for example, 5 small clothing stores, each one 1,000 square feet, that would not be eligible to use the retail store classification, since each individual store on its own is smaller than 5,000 square feet. Restaurants and cafes also are not eligible to use the retail store definition because they're used for food sales. This is another example of making sure you carefully review the definition of property types for Energy Star, because these definitions can be very specific, so it's the LP's responsibility to make sure that they're being applied accurately. As far as use details go, the LP does not have to necessarily physically count every single use detail if it's not practical to do so. For example, the number of computers in a large office building may not be practical to count. The number of refrigeration units in a supermarket, however, is something that can be reasonably physically counted during a site visit. So in either case, the LP must use the resources available to them, including, for example, building IT department reports, human resources, other documentation, to confirm the accuracy of all of the use details to the best of their ability. Finally, make sure that the gross floor area for all individual property uses reported on the application add up to the actual total building gross floor area for the entire 12-month application period. Some examples of property use details may include the number of weekly operating hours, the number of workers on the main shift, the number of computers in an office building. A multifamily housing building would ask for things like the number of residential living units and the number of bedrooms. Hospitals require a count of MRI machines. These use details will vary by property type, so again, just like with property type definitions, be sure to familiarize yourself with specific definitions for each use detail on the application. All right, we'll go through some common examples here. Number of workers on the main shift should reflect the total number of workers present during the primary shift of the day. It's not the total number of employees necessarily. If you have a day shift of 120 workers and a night shift of 50 workers, the number of workers on the main shift would be 120, even though the building has 170 total employees. This count should also include only workers. It should not include clients or customers, patients, any other visitors to the building who do not actually work there. The number of computers includes only desktops, laptops, and Chromebooks or netbooks, assuming those Chromebooks or netbooks are charged and stored on site at all times. It does not include tablets, extra monitors, or other computer-related equipment such as printers, scanners, projectors, etc. Weekly operating hours is another use detail that can sometimes cause confusion, so be sure to look up the definition as it applies to the specific property type you're dealing with. In general, for offices and warehouses, the number of weekly operating hours is the total number of hours per week when the majority of workers are present. So in that example from the previous slide with a day shift of 120 workers and a night shift of only 50 workers, only the hours of the day shift would be included in the operating hours, since fewer than half of the main shift workers are present during the night shifts. If there are two tenants of the same type whose hours differ by more than 10%, then they may be entered into Portfolio Manager as two separate property uses. Otherwise, all tenants with similar weekly operating hours should be entered as a single property use. Hours should not include times when only maintenance, custodial, or security staff are present, nor should they include HVAC startup or shutdown time. For other building types that directly serve the public, such as retail stores, bank branches, and courthouses, the weekly operating hours are a little simpler. They're simply the hours when the building is open to the public. Multifamily housing has a few use details worth taking note of. The first is the number of residential living units, specifically the number of units in a low-rise, mid-rise, and high-rise setting. The setting type refers to the number of floors in that particular building or wing of the property. So for example, if you have a single 12-story building, that's a high-rise setting. So if that building has 200 units, all 200 units should be reported as units in a high-rise setting, even the units that are below the 10th floor. In general, a single building property that does not have multiple wings of different heights should report 100% of units in a single setting type that corresponds to the height of the building. Number of bedrooms is another detail worth mentioning, particularly when studio apartments are involved. For purposes of calculating the ENERGY STAR score, studio apartments should be counted as having 1 bedroom, not 0. Parking and data centers are two topics about which a lot can be said, especially data centers, which we're actually having a webinar later in May. I think the end of May, we're having a data center focused webinar, so be sure to register for that if you're interested. So we won't go into too much detail here. For parking, suffice it to say that when possible, parking should be excluded from the application. If parking lots and garages are not separately metered and cannot be excluded, then it's usually acceptable to include them in a separate parking property use, as long as the total for any garage floor area is no larger than the total area of the building itself. Data centers are a complex topic, and like I said, we have a full hour-long training coming soon for them, as well as a wealth of documentation and FAQs. So if you deal with data centers or buildings that contain smaller data centers, be sure to familiarize yourself with the policies surrounding them. Most importantly, make sure that the space in question meets EPA's definition of a data center. A smaller server closet with no dedicated cooling or UPS, for example, likely does not meet the data center definition. If your space does meet the data center definition, make sure that you're metering your IT energy correctly per EPA guidelines at the UPS output and including only IT equipment. If you do not have EPA compliant metering in place and your data center is a smaller one within a larger building, such as an office building, you can also use the data center energy estimates option. When this presentation is sent out to attendees, you'll be able to access each of these links and find more information on data centers. And again, if you're interested in attending that data center specific training, you can register for that on esbuildings.webex.com now. Moving on to energy consumption. The LP is responsible for making sure that all energy consumption reported on the application is accurate and complete. The first section of the application dealing with energy consumption is the data overview, shown here. In this section, the LP should primarily pay attention to the site energy use summary, right here, where they should ensure that all fuel types are reported and the fuel breakdown is reasonable given the local climate and the property type. For example, an office building in Miami probably should not have 80% of their energy coming from natural gas in most cases, but that might be reasonable for something like a warehouse in Minnesota. So just make sure that that breakdown is reasonable and matches up with the energy bills that you review. The LP should also review the energy intensity, in particular the source EUI. Source energy refers to the energy used at the source for each fuel type to produce one equivalent unit of on-site energy. Grid electricity, for example, has a national average source-to-site ratio of 2.8, meaning that every 1 kilowatt hour of electricity used on site, on average, took 2.8 kilowatt hours at the source to produce. LPs should familiarize themselves with the concept of source energy and the typical source energy use intensity ranges for the property types they deal with, so that they can assess whether the source EUI shown in the application is reasonable or not. The next section shows a list of all energy meters at the property, including their start and end dates, and whether they're still in use. The LP should verify that all energy meters and fuel sources at the property have been included. This should be verified with energy bills as well as during the physical site visit to ensure that there are no energy sources or meters that are not being accounted for. Energy reported on the application must be 100% actual metered energy taken from utility bills. Estimated energy is not acceptable for purposes of ENERGY STAR certification, so the LP should ensure that no estimated energy is being reported. Finally, if there are on-site renewables at the property, including CHP systems, on-site solar arrays, or on-site wind turbines, it's important to refer to EPA's Green Power documentation to ensure that the energy produced by these systems is being reported accurately. This is especially true in the case of net metered systems, where a property's on-site generation system is sending some of the energy it produces back to the grid. Net metered values are not acceptable for ENERGY STAR certification purposes, so it's important to make sure that all energy is being accurately reported per EPA guidelines when this type of setup exists. And that's all available in the Green Power technical reference as well as in FAQs. Finally, each energy meter will have its own section in the application. It's the LP's job to verify that each entry is accurate as billed. This doesn't necessarily mean that they need to review each and every bill, although it's not a bad idea to do so, but it does mean that any discrepancies or irregularities should be investigated. If there are any entries on the meter that do not appear to fit into the patterns of the rest of the meter, or that you suspect might raise questions for the review team, circle them and include a detailed explanatory note in the notes field that specifically addresses the irregular entries. Once all the information on the application has been verified, the LP can attest to this by applying their professional seal or stamp to the application and then signing and dating it. If the LP doesn't have a seal or stamp, the review team can also verify licensure by looking up the LP's license on the relevant licensing authority's website, usually the state. Applications must be submitted within 120 days of the year ending date, so it's important to time your site visit and verification to allow enough time to submit before that 120-day period runs out. Once an application has been submitted, there's always a chance that it may be selected for an audit. Audits are conducted at random throughout the year, and once an application has been selected for an audit, it cannot be approved until the audit has been completed. Audits are used to protect the integrity of the Energy Star brand, as well as to improve the application process and supporting resources. Since the audit is primarily meant to assess the LP's process and knowledge, it's recommended that the LP actively participate in the audit process. The LP and the applicant will be asked to provide a variety of documentation, including copies of all utility bills during the 12-month application period, documentation or an explanation of how each use detail was verified, and the completed measurement form for indoor environmental quality, which again, that should have been completed during the site visit, ideally. All right, those are the highlights of the LP guide. However, as noted at the beginning of this presentation, this training is not a substitute for actually reading the guide itself. If you're a PE or an RA who plans to verify Energy Star commercial building applications in the future, whether or not you've already done so in the past, please be sure to access the LP guide at the link shown here and give it a read before verifying applications. The guide was last updated in September 2018, so if you last read it years ago, it's a good idea to reread it now, make sure your knowledge is up to date. Also included on this slide are some links to other certification-specific webinars. For any questions not covered in the guide or in this presentation, we encourage you to make use of our FAQs at www.energystar.gov/buildingshelp, or to review the additional training materials or sign up for future webinars at the links shown here. In particular, we'll be talking a little bit more about this in a second, but the overview of changes to 2018 and 2019 certification application rules, we'll have webinars on that on May 9th and June 13th. And then our regular how to apply for the Energy Star and verifying the Energy Star application webinars will be taking place in May and June as well. And in addition, at this WebEx link is the data center specific training registration that I mentioned earlier. All right, I'm going to